Iniziamo questa sessione su Tu sei qui, come orientarsi nella tempesta di disinformazione. Faccio solo questa piccola intro in italiano perché in realtà questo panel sarà in inglese perché abbiamo due speaker che parlano solo inglese. Hi Whitney, and she's ready, and Johanna here. Per la traduzione sapete già come fare, dovete connettervi alla rete Translation IJF23 e poi inquadrare il QR code e niente, il sistema farà la traduzione live di quello che diciamo. Spero anche del mio Ital-English, quindi che lo capisca bene. So, thank you very much for being here today. I am Nicola Bruno. I am a journalist, co-founder of Dataninja, and also a professor of visual storytelling at University of Modena and Reggio Emilia. Together with me today we have Whitney Phillips. She is connected from the Pacific Standard Time Zone, right? So it's very, very early in the morning. Thank you very much for joining us and for being with us. And Whitney Phillips is a professor of digital platforms and ethics at the University of Oregon. And she's also the author of You Are Here, a book she co-authored 2 years ago together with Ryan Milner. And today we have also here in Perugia, we present also the preview of the book that will be out in Italian by the 5th of May. So in the next 2 weeks you will find this book in both online bookshops and physical bookshops. I'm very happy to have worked on this book because I think that this is one of the best books I have read during the last years about disinformation and misinformation. Together with me and Whitney, here in Perugia, we have also Johanna Vehkoo. She is a journalist based in Finland, where she has covered a lot the issues of disinformation, hate speech. And Johanna is also professor of practice in journalism at University of Tampere and co-founder of Longplay. Unfortunately, Stefano Moriggi, who should have been here together with us, could not make to join us here in Perugia. So we will try to discuss about the main topics that Stefano usually deals with, that is media literacy, media education. Maybe I will do to you, Whitney and Johanna, a question also about this. When I have read the English version, the English edition of You Are Here 2 years ago, I was very happy because the authors, they do a framing of the disinformation and misinformation issues totally different from what we usually hear about these topics. According to Whitney and Ryan, it's not a matter of true and false dichotomy. It's not also a matter of understanding what are the intentions of who is producing this information. We usually teach also in our media literacy classes to understand who is behind or what are the intentions of these people. According to Phillips and Milner, we have to go far beyond to better understanding the issue of disinformation, and they propose this framing of this issue as an information crisis issues. We are living in an information crisis that is very similar to the environmental crisis that we are affording in the physical world. And if we approach the disinformation and misinformation topic in an ecological way, disinformation claims and campaigns can be framed as acts of pollution. So we have polluters who are spreading pollution, who are making dirty the environment we live in. This is an interesting framing. It's not just a metaphor. It's not just let's apply the ecological metaphor to this disinformation ecosystem. It's much more because if we think about the web, the social media, as an environment where we all have responsibilities, where we all can pollute the environment, even if when we don't want, even if when we have good intentions, everything can change. Everything can change the way we frame, for example, journalism, and we will discuss about this today here in Perugia, but also changes what are the solutions that we are envisioning for finding a solution to the information crisis. We will see as also the media literacy efforts can be problematic if we don't see this in an ecological way. I would like to start with a question to Whitney. And the first question is about a topic that is very much usually interests journalists, and journalists usually they defend very strongly the freedom of information, the transparency. There is this myth that facts should always be brought to light, that has said by a very famous US Supreme Court sentence, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And in your here, you, Whitney and Ryan, you criticize this myth of radical transparency, for example, referring to the WikiLeaks involvement in 2016 elections, or other cases of journalists covering the so-called alt-right in the US. I'm sure that most of the journalists that are present here, they or that are listening to us also online, they are ready to defend this transparency, also this extreme freedom of information, because usually this is seen as the only counterbalance that we can have to censorship or also to self-censorship. Whitney, why do you think that the myths of transparency and freedom of information can be very problematic in the current information ecosystem?
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Good morning, or good morning for me. Thank you so much for having me. And that's a good question, and it's a tricky question. And I will say right out of the gate, I am not saying that journalists should not do journalism. And I am not saying that facts are not good. Facts are absolutely good. The issue is that facts and facts alone are not enough. That just because something is true, just because there are facts out there, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to solve the problems that we would want them to solve. And some of the context here is, you mentioned the idea of sunlight is the best disinfectant. A context in the United States is also the idea, these two related ideas, that more information is always better, and that very, very basic concept in the United States is the marketplace of ideas is always going to basically upvote the best information. So the assumption there, and this relates very strongly to journalism and how journalism is taught in the US, that the more information there is, the best information will always prevail. So you can never go wrong. You just forward whatever facts you find, and people who are rational and deliberate beings are going to weigh those facts. They'll ultimately come to the right conclusions, and then, great, we've solved the problem. Now, speaking from a United States context, that hasn't worked so well for us, that when facts have been just perpetuated, even the most true information, it has not solved mis and disinformation problems in the United States. In fact, it has contributed to greater polarization, the greater spread of falsehood around the 2020 election, for instance, that facts have just had an ambivalent consequence. And that doesn't mean that we need to no longer foreground or facts. And it doesn't mean that journalists should not try to seek the truth. They absolutely should. But it's this initial recognition that facts don't always work the way that we might want them to. And part of that is just how people process information, the fact that, you know, political belief often has more to do with identity than facts themselves. So there's already some issues with how people process information. But then beyond that, there are network issues that we don't always know as journalists or as individual people on social media. We don't know where our facts are going to go, and we don't know what our facts are going to do because of these really intense network dynamics that make predicting the spread of information very difficult. So we might want it to end up with a certain audience, and we might want it to have a certain effect on that audience. And maybe it does for that intended audience, but maybe it does something weirder or worse for other audiences that actually use that information in a harmful way. And one example in the United States right now, the fact of Donald Trump's indictments, 34 of them. For people who are not fans of Donald Trump, that information forwards a particular, I mean, people come away with certain conclusions about whether this man should be president again. But for people who support Donald Trump, discussion of those 34 counts, what that can reinforce is this idea that there's a witch hunt, that the liberals are out to get Trump, and that just re-entrenches this idea that any outcome of an election that does not result in Donald Trump being the victor ultimately is illegitimate. So it's the same piece of information, but it's just the way that it travels and the impact it has, it does different things for different groups. And that's the main relationship that I think we need to think really carefully about when it comes to facts. So I like facts. I like facts very much, but they're just not as reliable an ally as we might wish them to be.
Yeah, you in the book, you make the example of the WikiLeaks role in 2016 elections, especially with the Podesta cables, right? And you see this as, for example, an example of unintended consequences, no? What WikiLeaks did maybe was in good intentions, and but what happened then with these cables was not for a good cause, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so journalists, so WikiLeaks, you know, released all of these emails, and you know, the content of the emails was not exactly a bombshell, but there were lots of nuggets that particularly people on the right wing were able to descend on and helped fuel the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, the idea that Hillary Clinton and top Democrats were running a satanic sex ring out of the back of a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. They were not. But pieces from these emails were used to forward that conspiracy theory. So that's already problematic enough. But then our sort of mainstream journalists in the United States, they descended on the story and they started repeating the fact that this information had been leaked and then repeating the conspiracy theory over and over and over and over. And what that ultimately did is spread the theory outside of these initial sort of smaller right-wing networks, and then just shifted the public discourse to where the center point was conspiracy, and maybe, you know, maybe not forwarding the claim that Hillary Clinton was running a satanic child sex ring, but that she was up to something, that there was something nefarious about those emails. So it really muddied the waters of the kind of discourse that was possible. Was it wrong for journalists to report that it had happened? No, it wasn't. Of course, you report what happens. It's how you report, and it's what you foreground, and it's the size of the story you tell. The problem with a lot of the reporting in 2016, journalists were actually telling very small stories about little pieces as opposed to the larger truth that people actually needed to understand about election interference and the consequences of disinformation. So it wasn't that the story was told, it was that the story wasn't told as thoughtfully as it could have been.
Thank you, Whitney. We will discuss later also about this issue. It's not a matter, as you said, of to report or not to report. It's a matter of how we report. So what is the best strategy for reporting on controversial issues? And today I'm very happy to have here with us also Johanna, because Johanna, during the last years, has been at the center of an interesting, controversial, and problematic for her judicial and journalistic case that has been very much discussed in Finland and also abroad. And actually, Johanna had a confrontation with a well-known right-wing politician who first targeted her and then was, we could say, platforming Johanna and also stalking her, going beyond everything she was doing in Finland, just to gain more prominence, to have more visibility, to reach more audience maybe. Johanna, can you tell very quickly what happened? I know it's not easy, it's a long story, but you have also written a book about this, you have talked a lot in public events. Can you tell us what happened and how you came out also to a very important sentence from the Finnish Supreme Court that was a sentence on freedom of expression, journalism, and hate speech?
Yeah. Thank you, Nico. This is a large question because, of course, the answer to this is an entire book that I've written about the case. And the reason why I had to write an entire book about it was because there was a lot of coverage in the news about the case, but it lacked a lot of the context and it lacked so much nuance that I really just had to write an entire book. And the book is called, well, of course the name is in Finnish, but it's called The Trial, according to Kafka's famous novel from 1925, because this is easily the most Kafkaesque thing that ever happened to me. And to cut a few corners here, but I've been reporting on disinformation for plenty of years, and this happened during the sort of beginning of the so-called fake news debate, 2015, in Finland, when I started writing about these things. And in 2016, there was this group called Monoculture, which tells you all about, what they want to say about themselves, because they want a monocultural Finland as opposed to a multicultural Finland. So this is like a very, very extremist, far-right group of people, led by a guy who is both an internet troll, but also a far-right politician who has been standing in lots of elections in Finland. But he just uses internet trolling as his political campaign method and his political strategy. So after quite a bit of campaigning that he directed at me and used me as a part of it, there was this case where he was actually coming to a physical situation where I was going to be. So his plan was to come there and stream me online on their YouTube channel, which had many thousands of subscribers. And it would have been a live stream where he would put the phone on my face and ask me questions. And these can be very, very intimidating situations. And he was going to give me a false identity and claimed that he was a journalist. The reason why I knew about this beforehand was because these people just talk about everything online, because they have this YouTube stream and they were planning this attack in the YouTube stream. So a friend of mine who uses her spare time in such a way that she actually watches these hours and hours of live streams by far-right extremists, she then alerted me to this fact. So then what did I do? I did what people did in 2016 when they want to vent something that they are angry about or intimidated about. So I wrote a Facebook post. And I called him a Nazi and a racist in this Facebook post, which, are true monikers. But he found out about this because another person, also a journalist, who was a Facebook friend of mine, she copied the update and published it on her public Facebook page. Mine wasn't public. And so this guy found out about my Facebook update, and he immediately then filed a criminal complaint about me for defamation. After this, he proceeded to say on his public live stream that he doesn't think this is defamation, and in fact, he thinks that defamation should not be in the criminal law in the first place, but he just thinks that I'm annoying. So the public prosecutor fell for this trick and didn't see this for what it was, that it was actually trolling. The guy says up front, he doesn't even lie about it. He says that, I don't believe that this is defamation. I don't even believe that defamation exists. I think you should be able to say anything about anybody. But I want to take this journalist to court for defamation. And then the public prosecutor plays along and basically indicts me for defamation. And this court case lasted for 5 years. It went through all the levels of court in the Finnish judicial system. I got sentenced for defamation. So I was guilty by 2 levels of court. And then I took it to the Supreme Court, which then freed me of these charges. And this has been called in Finland the most important case law about freedom of speech, political freedom of speech in Finland for a couple of decades. So in the end, it was worth it to see it till the end, but it cost me like 40,000 euros and my ability to work for a while and all kinds of things. Not to mention, a long-lasting stain on my reputation for being indicted and all of that stuff, but what ho. The thing is, the question should have been whether somebody who himself proudly calls himself a racist can take someone else to court for doing the same. And the question should have been like, if he himself does not believe that defamation should even be illegal, and if he believes that I did not defame him, should I really be prosecuted for that in the first place? So his motivations were not interesting to the court system, the judicial system at all. They kind of chose to be blind about this phenomenon completely and never even commented on this in any of the verdicts, even though we showed to every court the video where he says that he doesn't believe that this is defamation. But this wasn't even worthy of comment. So that's one of the reasons I really had to write a book about this, because this phenomenon that I name in the book as strategic trolling is a political strategy that the far right uses. And our institutions, such as the police, the judicial system, and the media, fail to recognize this. And that is a huge problem.
Yeah. Thank you, Johanna, for your sum up of your entire book. And
that was the most concise I can be about this.
Yeah. Then, if you have questions about what happened to Johanna, we can go more into. And I think that I found very interesting the case of Johanna related to the "You Are Here" book, because in the book you and Ryan, you talk a lot about the role of amplification that media plays in the current information ecosystem. You are very critical, for example, of the role that you as media had in amplifying, giving visibility to what you call the alternative right, alt-right meme. So something that was nothing new, something that had a lot of roots, ancient roots actually, in racism and in other US phenomenon, that actually has been presented as something new, something that had to be told, some facts we said before that journalists had to cover, no? And actually what happened with this alternative right meme was that the left-wing press has been almost baited by what you call entrepreneurs of manipulation, organized manipulators that they just do what Johanna tells us. They have this strategy of trolling for getting a platform where they have visibility, where they can have their message spread. And there is an interesting also photo you discuss in the book, that is the photo about another trial, the court hearing for the white suprematist James Fields. I don't know if you can show the photo now. Yeah, now we are going to show the photo so they can understand. And yeah, actually we have the court, and there was this white suprematist that was just him and a few people around him, and a lot of journalists, press around him, amplifying actually his message and trying to find a new narrative corner to present these actually racist groups as something new, as something that had to be told. Whitney, can you explain us why also when the press has good intentions, you play the risk of playing into the hands of those who want to pollute the information ecosystem? And what are the solutions? You said before, it's not a matter of what to cover, what not to cover, it's a matter of how to cover, how you report. What do you think that the most responsible media outlets should do? You, in the last chapter of the book, you present a strategy. You say that silence can be an option, but it's not the only option. So it's not just a matter of not covering some issues, but it's also a matter of how you cover and how you present the facts.
There's so much in that question and so much overlap with Johanna's story. And so I want to, I think, focus a little bit on the trolling element, the strategic uses of trolling rhetoric in a lot of the right-wing communications that were happening, particularly in 2016. But this happens even now. You see this in the US in politicians, mainstream politicians using these tactics and strategies. But one of the things about the white supremacists that were, I mean, white supremacy is not new in the United States. It wasn't like they suddenly there were racists because Donald Trump was running for president. Of course not. But what a lot of Trump supporters did, who were associated with this group that wasn't really a group, the alt-right, that was the label that people used to describe it, they weren't just saying racist things, they were also doing it in a trollish way. And that gave them a kind of plausible deniability. So they would say something really outrageous, and if they got called out on it, they would be able to say, well, I was just trolling, or whatever they would do. And that confused a lot of reporters, for one thing, but it also, they were actively engaging in these strategies to be as incendiary, as outrageous, and often as ironic as possible. There was a lot of humor that was baked into this. And what reporters often did is they would just repeat what was said. So they would stand around this, white supremacist, and this is the image that was just shown as one example, but they would stand around anyone saying something incendiary, hateful, particularly if it had the sort of trollish wink, if there was irony, and they would just repeat it verbatim. And that was really damaging, because what that did is it gave a microphone to people who otherwise wouldn't have had a microphone. Now, it was important to call attention to what was happening, calling attention to the trolling game, talking about the strategies and tactics, helping people understand what was actually going on and what they could do to either push back or not feed into it. Those were important stories to tell, but that's not what the coverage did. The coverage just handed microphones over. And with the assumption, and this was happening within our mainstream press in the US, the assumption, again, was that light would disinfect. If you just showed people the terrible racist things that these guys were saying, people would understand the danger, no one would vote for Donald Trump, and the problem would solve itself. Clearly, that's not what happened. So, in 2016, that's really where this problem came to bear. It was happening with people that were on the fringes, though. What's going on now in the United States, it's weird moment, is that a lot of those same strategies and tactics of trolling that had been associated with online fringe groups, that's what our mainstream Republican politicians do regularly. And it's very difficult. Journalists really struggle to know how to respond to it. And again, you can't not say that something is happening because it has consequences, especially when you think about the risks of stochastic violence. So the idea that if someone in a US context like Donald Trump or like Marjorie Taylor Greene or whomever, they basically target certain groups or say this group of Democrats, they're grooming children, they're dangerous. You don't know who's going to show up with a gun. You don't know who's going to act on that. So the risks have to be highlighted, but you must explain the strategies and tactics that are being used. You must tell the larger story about threats to democracy. So the real, approach that journalists should take, explain the stakes, tell a big story. The small stories is where the devil is kind of in those details. So telling big stories is one really important element of reporting. The other really big component of this is, and I'm speaking again towards a US context because I can speak to those numbers these statistics more directly. Our mainstream news organizations are very, very homogenous. And one of the problems with homogenous reporting is that people's myopias, the things that they don't notice, the things that they're not necessarily worrying about, they're not worrying about getting attacked by a white supremacist, and so they're able to sort of talk about it in a more abstract way. When you have a very homogenous newsroom, stories get missed, angles get missed, the bigness gets overlooked. And so what has to happen as a response to mis and disinformation and engaging responsibly with a reactionary movement, there has to be diversity in the newsroom. There has to be more women, there has to be more people of color, there has to be more people who can identify different kinds of threats to build basically bulwark into journalistic reporting so that it's not the same framework that's telling all of the different stories. So I think that that's really critical. And then also just recognizing that, as I mentioned earlier, facts are not naturally corrective. So it's really interesting and amazing that this book that Ryan and I wrote is now going to be in this new context, in this new language. One of the other things that he and I have done over the last year and a half is translate that book and its lessons. The last chapter is a lot of media literacy strategies. We've adapted that book to 13 and 14-year-olds. So it's not doing any of the political stuff. It's not talking about Donald Trump, but it is talking about what our roles and responsibilities are and how just because something is true doesn't mean that it's gonna do good, that's not an assumption that we can make. So I think that it's not just about how do reporters tell these stories differently, how do they create a more diverse reporting space. It's also how do we talk to young people about these same issues. For journalists, it's definitely acute. The platforms are much larger, the stakes are very high, but how do we get people thinking differently about these issues when they're young? So that because they're gonna be the future journalists, and it's very hard to change a 65-year-old journalist's mind about certain things. And in a lot of ways, having institutional norms is good. But we live in a very weird world, and so reporting has to contend with that. We've got to train people young for them to understand the network dynamics, the limitations of facts, just what our responsibilities are individually and collectively. So it's a really big question of what do we do, and the solution needs to happen within newsrooms, but it can't be confined to newsrooms.
Yeah, thank you. And talking about young audiences, you discuss a lot in the book also about the memes that usually for young people is just a funny stuff, something, just humor, no? And as said by you, it's not just because it's a fact you should report this. And also with meme, you say that we should always be very conscious of what's behind the meme, what's the culture, what are the values. For example, another strategy used by white supremacists or used by politicians is to disguise their message behind funny memes. And in the book, you propose a strategy that is very similar to what's also to other kind of content. No, you say also a meme usually has a root that is a root in the white culture, has roots in the culture of US-centric, and it's not a global phenomenon as usually it gets represented. Maybe we will discuss later also about the role of memes. Before, I would like to ask to Johanna, what do you think is according to your experience, what is the best way to interact with manipulators who target journalists? It's better to go out, to give them some visibility, and so to use the light, to try to disinfect them through the light, or it's better not to give them visibility? I know it's not an easy question, but maybe you can.
It's obviously quite often it has to be a case-by-case consideration, but the thing is that you need to be aware of the possibility of manipulation, and you need to be aware of their tactics in order to make informed decisions about what kind of reporting you're going to do. But actually, this is something that I have been discussing with my students quite a lot, because I teach journalism students at the moment at the university, and some advice that I gave them is something that draws a lot from actually Whitney's report from a few years ago called The Oxygen of Amplification. And one of the things I definitely said to consider was that, you always need to consider, has this thing actually spread, far enough to even report it? Because quite often, actually, the best solution is to not report the thing at all. But then, if you after consideration decide to report it, then you need to always remember that disinformation is very contagious, and we know from lots and lots of research that repetition actually makes things seem true. So more you repeat the message or some kind of violent language, for instance, the more it sticks to people's minds and starts to actually feel true to them. So we really need to avoid using these manipulators' language, and definitely do not use their own framing of events. Then also, do not center them. Do not give the platform to the troll or the manipulator. Don't make them the main character of the story, the mouthpiece, basically. And then you also need to use, in all disinformation reporting, I think this is something that lacks quite often, is that you need to use precise language, like what exactly happened, where, can you actually decipher why it happened, and what the motivations were, and how big a phenomenon are we talking about. Like, for instance, in Finland, quite recently we had parliamentary elections, and a lot of the newspapers reported that, there seems to be some manipulation going on Twitter. Maybe it's the Russians. And actually, what they were reporting about were 4 Twitter accounts posting the same thing. 4 accounts. I would not have reported that, actually.
Okay, thank you, Johanna. And I don't know if you have any question for Whitney or Johanna. You can. We have a microphone, I think. Yeah.
While you're thinking about that, I might add to that list that you should always consider who might benefit from the story if you run it the way you're planning to run it, and if the far right or whoever like that is going to benefit, then you should reconsider your approach. Okay, you can think about this said by Johanna. And maybe, I had also another question, because Whitney, you first talked about a new book that you just published, that is a guide for teenagers, and how they should, what's the title actually? It's
Share Better and Stress Less.
Stress less, yeah. So it's a positive message, let's say. And you actually, also in this book, You Are Here, I say, you are skeptical about media literacy programs that are just focused on fact-checking, on debunking, or just focused on critical thinking, not because fact-checking and critical thinking are not good, but maybe because they cannot be enough, and also because then we can have unintended consequences also with fact-checking and critical thinking. Can you explain us more why you are skeptical, and also what's your view about, for example, there are a lot of people, me too, I'm involved in media literacy, and we are all working with also now there is this pre-banking approach that is taking more people are using more. Can you tell us what you think is the best strategy for for introducing the media literacy issues with young people?
Yeah, and here too, as you said, I'm not saying that teaching young people how to decipher fact from fiction isn't important. It's very important, but it's not exclusively the only thing you should focus on. You know, two things that there's one big change between You Are Here as we wrote it and then the adaptation for young readers. And that was distinguishing between the concept of information pollution. And we sort of were using it in a dualistic way in You Are Here. One of those things I wish that when we write books, there's always something you want to go back and revise because your thinking has evolved. And in that case, we were bouncing back and forth between information that was true but still harmful and then information that was outright false. So when we adapted this for young readers, we just codified that. And so we distinguish between polluted information, so information that itself is toxic and bad, and then polluting information. So the information could be true, but it still fills our minds with sludge, essentially. And the reason that that matters is not just because it allows us to consider how true information, like if you hear about a friend who's being bullied, talking about their bullying on social media might open them up to more bullying. That might not help them. It might not be what the person wants. So not only does it let you maybe have different kinds of conversations and think differently about consent and consequence, but it also foregrounds something that I think is missing from a lot of conversations about media literacy, and that's the connection to mental health. And not in terms of, so there's a lot of interesting research that's coming out that talks about some of the mental health components of belief in conspiracy theory stuff, and that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is when any of us, young people, older people, when we get overwhelmed, when we're scared, when we're angry, we tend to be much more reactive in our sharing because just in terms of how brains work, the frontal part of our brain essentially goes offline when we get really upset. So then we're just acting out of the older part of our brain that fights, flies, and freezes. Fights, flees, and freezes, excuse me. And so younger people who are not trained in the US, at least, to talk about how they're feeling, they don't understand the relationship between how they're feeling and what they're sharing. And so by talking about polluting information, you can also talk about information that's just stressful. When you're posting stuff that's really stressful to other people, that maybe doesn't break any of the existing media literacy rules, but it can still set in motion pollution chain reactions where upset people upset more people, and then people get frazzled, and then they start sharing things in ways that are not going to be particularly helpful. So I think that expanding what counts as media literacy, how we can bring a psychological component to it, how we can teach young people and older people to bring the energy down, to recognize when they're going to a place of distress, and then bring it down, downregulate, that can be helpful because that all is part of allowing us to have the perspective that we need to ask the important questions. What kind of response is appropriate in this instance? There is no one size fits all, as Johanna was saying. You can't just respond to everything in the same way. Our networks are too complicated. We're too complicated. So what is going to help us assess things on a case-by-case basis in a thoughtful way that thinks about consequences, and that's grounded in ethics and an ethic of care. And so I think that that's one thing that we really need to emphasize in media literacy education, in addition to all the stuff that we're already doing.
Yeah, thank you, Whitney. In You Are Here, you talk about this law that I didn't know about, the POSE law, that actually is this law of the digital ecosystem that you cannot control where information goes, and sometimes you can have remixed audiences, you say. You produce a piece of content, but you don't know actually who will be the audience that will get that information. And so this is also something that we should always consider, both as educators or journalists. And Johanna, you have something to add to this media literacy debate about fact-checking, critical thinking, and...
Well, in terms of fact-checking, there was quite a lot of discussion in Whitney's book about whether or not fact checks backfire, because I also am very aware of the body of research where, you know, some work says that fact checks can often backfire, as in they reinforce the disinformation that they were trying to debunk. Then some research says that this doesn't happen. So, but this is very, very US-centric. And it looks like when fact checks backfire, it's usually a case of a very polarizing issue. So I would really like to see research in less polarized societies about fact checks and whether they backfire in the same way as they might in the US. But I've yet to see this sort of research. I don't know, Nico, if you've seen any.
No, yeah, I think that there is something on polarization, and but also on polarization that is not so. I was reading actually a recent paper on polarization that is not so spread as we usually talk, because there are a lot of issues where we have no polarization at all. So also talking about the social media as a polarization actor is not true. But yeah, I agree, and and I think that another fact-checking issues that it's interesting is that usually has been presented as the only remedy to a crisis that is actually bigger and involves different kind of aspects. So usually when I teach media literacy, I always start from a factual approach. So let's see if this information is accountable, is true or not. But then I say that the factual is not the only thing we have to consider. We have also the emotion. We have also the cognition, as you say, issues. We have this repetition, for example, problem that even if something is not true, even if something is dangerous, if you repeat this, then it starts to become true in the mind of the people. And I don't know now if you, because we have just 5 minutes left, so I don't know if you have, okay, we have a question, maybe we have to wait for the microphone, otherwise people online cannot hear you. Equi?
Thank you. Filipa from Portugal. I'm very curious, first of all, thank you so much. It was a very interesting session. And to ask Johanna, how do you deal with social media right now? Because sometimes it's so hard for us to know where the journalist ends and the private persona begins. So are you more careful or not? And yes, that's the...
The thing is, I thought I was careful back in the day. Like in 2016, when this happened, I had these like lists on Facebook, and I posted this to a list that only contained about 200 people, whereas I have like a couple of thousand Facebook friends, and I would never make any public updates. And this update that I made was only for like a couple of hundred people, most of them my colleagues, journalists. So I did not believe that this would spread from there. So I thought I was being cautious. So there you go, you know. Of course, it made me quite cynical about who I can trust and what I can post on social media. So yeah, it's made me a lot more cautious about stuff, but also to use it less as well, which I think, you know, has been healthy in many ways.
Any other? Thank Johanna. Is there any other question here? Yeah, wait for the microphone. Otherwise, people online cannot hear you. Qui, prima fila.
Well, I have one question for Johanna. After this bad experience which you had, bad or maybe in some ways also good, because you have learned a lot, I imagine. What advice would you give to other colleagues to avoid a situation like this? And also another question for Whitney, from what I've understood, I don't know if I've understood well, it's very important for a journalist to predict what effect that some news could have on an audience, and what the audience who will receive that news will be. And how can we predict who will receive that news, and what effect that news will have on that audience, and how this can help in our job to make the right choice?
Thank you very much. Johanna, you can go with that.
Well, it's very difficult to say, how could you avoid such a thing? Maybe, digging yourself into a hole without the internet, probably, because it can happen to anyone. That's the thing, because I think basically these kinds of people, they want a reaction out of you, and that's what they were trying for quite a long while. And then what actually broke me was the thing that they were going to come and physically harass me. And that was too much, I'd dealt with a lot of stuff, a lot of online abuse before, and hadn't said anything. But after this, that was I think everybody, everyone has a breaking point, and mine was there. Yeah. Now my breaking point is a lot higher. But at least these people, they can't do anything worse than take me to court for 5 years and take all my money and my work and my reputation. So it's quite difficult to do anything worse.
Thank you, Johanna. And Whitney, you want to reply to the other question?
Yeah, so it is very difficult to predict audiences, and it may not be possible. In certain cases, though, understanding what the strategies and tactics of media manipulators are, if you know, okay, well, they're going to try to weaponize certain kinds of information, or this might benefit this particular group in this way, you sort of understand where they're coming from, what their motives are, what they want to accomplish, and then don't give that to them. And in some cases, again, it's going to be much more straightforward. If you're talking about a media manipulator, trollish white supremacist, all they want is to have their name in lights. So how do you minimize their desired outcome? In other cases, other stories, other groups, it's very difficult to know exactly what's going to happen. That's part of the challenge, is that information travels, like Johanna was just saying, thought it was a private communication, ended up not being. You couldn't have predicted that, but understanding as a journalist some of the network dynamics, the strange places that information can travel, what that can at least let you do or help you do is to just try to game out alternative scenarios, and keep in mind that just because you have an intended outcome doesn't mean that it will be that. And that just allows you to have a gut check and say, okay, what can I imagine? What is the worst possible outcome here? And how can I try to maybe avoid that? How can I build my story out to hopefully facilitate the most positive outcomes as opposed to the worst case scenarios? And it's hard to do, but just keeping in mind that that's a question to ask, I think, is important anytime you're trying to make an editorial decision.
Thank you, Whitney. It's okay for you? Okay. Is there a last question or not? Yeah, there is just the last one. We have just 2 minutes, so we have to be very quick. Quarta fila, anzi.
Hello, Christina again, also Portugal, also Germany in some ways. When you experienced this, Johanna, and you said that you had to pay 45,000 euros to defend yourself because you were just being open and transparent in your communication. That's how I see it. Which help did you get? If not from Finland, maybe is there help for journalists where you can go so that we don't shut up totally? Maybe that would be good to hear.
This is a very important question because I was a freelancer at the time, So it was very, very difficult to get any help. There were no, safety nets for me available at the time. But now there are, and so this case has helped create one. So some of the media companies actually put some seed money into a fund. So it's like there's a foundation now that can help freelance journalists who find themselves in a tricky situation like this. Help them financially with judicial fees and things like that, but also like with healthcare and stuff like that. But Europe-wise, there is Freedom. What is it called? It's based in Amsterdam, and well, there's the SLAP Foundation as well. But I'm talking about the name has escaped me. But anyway, if you Google something like freedom of expression and Netherlands, you'll probably find it. I should remember the name, but definitely it's a fund that helps journalists in legal battles. And of course, you mentioned SLAP, so this is a prime example of a SLAP case.
Okay, thank you. We have to go, and I'm very happy about this discussion today. Started from the book You Are Here, that was authored by Whitney and Ryan Milner in US. What I like about this book, it's also that actually it's a very, the final message is very positive because Whitney and Ryan invites us to do something, and we can do a lot of stuff to produce less pollution in the information ecosystem we live in. So I remind you, the book is available in English. You Are Here, MIT Press, and in Italian will be available from the 5th of May, Le Edizioni. And I have some copies here. If someone wants to check or wants to have one copy, maybe I can give some. Thank you very much. Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Johanna.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you both. This is great.